Look closely at the footage circulating across defense networks. An Iranian small boat is seen approaching a large cargo ship. The regime claims they are retaliating against the United States by seizing this vessel. It is broadcasted as a ruthless display of sovereign naval dominance. But watch the actual mechanics of the operation. As the operatives draw near, they do not breach the hull. Instead, a crew member simply opens the side door in the ship and lowers a pilot ladder. There is something very suspicious about the footage the IRGC released. Furthermore, this targeted vessel is not an American ship at all. It is owned by a company in Switzerland. Why would one of the most feared paramilitary syndicates on the planet broadcast such a bizarre, low-budget illusion to the globe? Because the true kinetic war is not happening on the water. It is happening inside their financial arteries, and those arteries are currently bleeding out. The Persian Gulf is no longer a navigable waterway. It has been transformed into a strategic cage. Over the last 12 days, a quiet, methodical strangulation has taken hold over one of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet. United States naval forces recently executed the seizure of the motor tanker Majestic X. This is not an isolated skirmish or a random act of piracy. It marks the sixth Iranian oil tanker captured by American forces since this comprehensive maritime blockade was initiated. But the physical captures of these massive vessels are merely the visible edge of the blade. The true devastation, the invisible architecture of this conflict, lies in the shadow traffic that has been permanently paralyzed. 33 separate vessels have been intercepted, firmly turned around, and forced back to Iranian ports. If you want to look past the mainstream headlines and understand the hidden financial architecture of global conflict, subscribe to the channel. We dissect the machinery of war every single week. Understand the relentless physics of this crisis. Oil is not a digital currency that can be encrypted and hoarded on a server. It is a heavy, highly volatile, physical commodity that requires massive, continuous logistical movement to hold any value. When 33 massive tankers are forced back into port, the onshore storage terminals rapidly reach maximum capacity. The subterranean pipelines back up. The refineries are forced to throttle down production. The entire extraction apparatus, the very backbone of the nation, begins to choke on its own lifeblood. We are witnessing the forced implosion of an energy superpower in real time. The adversary believed their asymmetric proxy networks and fast attack boats could outmaneuver conventional naval supremacy. That was the illusion. The brutal reality is that proxy empires cost billions to maintain, and the regime is suddenly generating nothing. To comprehend the scale of this financial trauma, you cannot look at standard economic metrics. Every 24 hours that this American cordon remains intact, Tehran loses approximately $400 million in export revenue. They are concurrently bleeding roughly $200 million in critical imports daily. $400 million erased daily is not a mere recession or a temporary dip in GDP. It is the mathematical equivalent of carpet bombing the country's treasury. The men at the highest echelons of the Islamic Republic, the supreme leadership, and the elite commanders are staring at a national ledger that is completely bleeding out. They are attempting to command an empire of violent proxies, funding and arming militias across Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen, while their primary revenue artery has been surgically and irreversibly severed. The strategic paradox is deafening. They possess hypersonic missiles and drones capable of striking targets across the entire region, yet they cannot move a single tanker of crude oil through their own backyard. But the sheer loss of state revenue is only the surface of this catastrophe. Nations can survive massive sovereign debt. They can print fiat currency until it becomes worthless. But the entity that truly relies on this smuggled oil is not the Iranian state itself. It is a completely different, infinitely more dangerous organization, and their paychecks just bounced. To understand the true depth of this fracture, you must discard the Western definition of a state military. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not a conventional armed force. They do not exist to protect the Iranian people, nor are they sustained by a standard national defense budget. The IRGC operates as a vast, autonomous ideological cartel. They are an independent corporate syndicate that effectively controls the Iranian oil industry, funding their sweeping operations by selling that exact crude. The illusion was that the Islamic Republic possessed an impenetrable, unified military machine fueled by unwavering religious zeal. The brutal reality is that this machine is an incredibly expensive mercenary operation. They maintain their iron grip on power through cold, hard cash. And right now, that crucial oil is not being sold. Because the IRGC funds its operations directly through these illicit exports, the American naval blockade is not merely a diplomatic sanction. It is a targeted financial decapitation. With the oil effectively landlocked and the shadow fleets permanently anchored, the syndicate has no incoming capital. The geopolitical commentators who compare Iran's current revenue drop to the economic contraction in Ukraine are demonstrating a fatal misunderstanding of the conflict's architecture. Ukraine is a unified nation fighting for existential survival, backed by massive international financial aid. In contrast, the Iranian regime does not enjoy the inherent loyalty of a patriot. It strictly buys the obedience of an enforcer. That purchased obedience is currently dissolving in front of our eyes. Reports leaking from within the security apparatus confirm a catastrophic breakdown in internal operations, with the IRGC already reporting massive payroll problems directly caused by the blockade. Members of the IRGC and the paramilitary Basij forces are now openly complaining that they are not receiving their promised monthly payments. Crippling pay delays had already begun hurting the Iranian security forces during the broader economic crisis of the last 12 months. Consequently, internal morale was steadily declining across the ranks. But the physical maritime blockade has accelerated this friction into a full-blown, systemic payroll collapse. A syndicate that demands absolute brutality from its foot soldiers cannot afford to miss a single payment. The men tasked with suppressing domestic uprisings and launching regional proxy wars are suddenly realizing that the treasury is completely empty. You need vast, continuous liquid wealth to sustain a multi-front shadow war. A regime that cannot pay the very men it relies upon to hold its own population hostage is a regime entering the final stages of terminal failure. They are effectively bankrupt, but the crisis compounding this missing payroll is far more lethal than a simple lack of domestic funds. Even if the cartel somehow manages to squeeze a few million barrels through the naval cordon, the physical currency they receive in return is functionally radioactive. The syndicate is trapped inside a global financial architecture explicitly designed to suffocate them, and their so-called international allies are quietly preparing to leave them to rot. To survive, a nation must physically feed its population. To feed a population of over 80 million people in a heavily sanctioned environment, a government must import millions of tons of grain. But on the international commodity markets, you cannot purchase agricultural shipments with revolutionary ideology or domestic propaganda. You must pay in capital that the seller actually trusts. The Iranian rial is effectively a toxic asset. The moment the rial crosses a sovereign border, its purchasing power evaporates into the ether. If Tehran wants to import the baseline necessities required to stave off mass civilian starvation, they absolutely require hard currency. Specifically, they are entirely dependent on the United States dollar. The illusion, loudly sold by geopolitical contrarians and rival state media, is the imminent death of the American dollar and the dawn of a new, multipolar financial order. The brutal reality dictated by the data is the exact opposite. The global financial system is not fracturing away from the United States. It is actively consolidating under its weight. Recent data confirms the US dollar's share of international transactions just surged to a staggering, record-breaking 51.1%. The dollar remains the absolute, undisputed apex predator of global trade. Historically, crude oil constituted a massive 70% of all Iranian export revenue. That crude was not just a commodity, it was their sole mechanism for financial alchemy. The IRGC utilized a labyrinthine shadow network to smuggle sanctioned barrels out of the Gulf, converting that physical oil into the physical greenbacks required to keep the state apparatus breathing. The American naval blockade didn't just physically stop massive cargo ships, it obliterated the regime's only reliable mechanism for currency conversion. Facing this absolute financial suffocation, the natural instinct of the Iranian leadership is to look east. The prevailing narrative among Western analysts suggests that Beijing will inevitably step in to underwrite the Islamic Republic, transforming Iran into a heavily subsidized, untouchable proxy of the Chinese Communist Party. It is a deeply comforting fiction for the hardliners in Tehran, but the geopolitical architecture of the 21st century is not built on ideological friendship. It is built on cold, ruthless, transactional calculus. The assumption that China will bankroll a collapsing Middle Eastern syndicate completely ignores the fundamental mathematics of Beijing's own structural vulnerabilities. China is a pragmatic buyer. They are not a wartime ally willing to bleed capital for another nation's holy war. Look strictly at the verified statements emerging from the highest levels of the Chinese government. President Xi Jinping recently demanded that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open for normal passage, explicitly citing the overarching interests of the international community. He did not issue this directive to protect Iranian naval sovereignty or to challenge the American blockade. He issued it to protect his own industrial supply lines. China imports roughly 11% of its crude oil from the Iranian shadow fleet. However, the Chinese manufacturing engine relies heavily on other Gulf nations, specifically Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait, for a massive 40% of their critical energy imports. If a kinetic conflict detonates in the Persian Gulf and disrupts that 40%, the Chinese economy violently seizes up. Beijing will never sacrifice its primary energy artery to save a secondary, highly volatile supplier. Furthermore, the underlying assumption that China possesses infinite sovereign capital to bail out failing proxy states is fundamentally broken. The Chinese financial system is currently fighting to contain its own internal rot. Beijing is actively petitioning the International Monetary Fund to orchestrate a bailout for Chinese banks that are heavily exposed to catastrophic loan defaults across the Belt and Road Initiative. These global infrastructure loans are failing so severely that the Chinese state cannot financially support its own predatory lending apparatus. They are frantically trying to plug massive structural holes in their own sinking hull. They are absolutely not in a position to sign blank checks for the IRGC, so the syndicate can wage an unwinnable high-intensity conflict against American carrier strike groups. The strategic isolation is absolute. The Islamic Republic is trapped in a geopolitical vacuum of its own making. They have zero access to the hard currency required to feed their population. Their primary global patron is quietly calculating the cost of abandoning them, and the heavily armed enforcers holding the regime together are staring at empty bank accounts. They are standing on the precipice of a localized apocalypse, and for the older men ruling from Tehran, this specific mathematical equation of economic collapse and unpaid security forces is deeply, terrifyingly familiar. The supreme leadership in Tehran is not ignorant of their own violent genesis. They understand precisely how rapidly a seemingly invincible autocracy can disintegrate. The Islamic Republic realizes that their current trajectory is a terrifyingly dangerous situation, mirroring the exact architecture of the Islamic Revolution that erupted 47 years ago. If we rewind the historical tape to 1978, the Iranian economy was entering a terminal, unrecoverable freefall. The sheer scale of the economic collapse in the years immediately leading up to the upheaval was the foundational reason a revolution was even mathematically possible. The illusion back then was that the Shah's heavily militarized state was a permanent, unbreakable fixture of the Middle East. The brutal reality was that his empire was entirely tethered to a single, highly vulnerable mechanism. Iran's sprawling oil sector was the absolute backbone of the entire national economy. When coordinated worker strikes hit the refineries, the men operating the machinery literally walked off their jobs. The mechanical production of crude collapsed overnight, and the physical exports completely stopped flowing out of the Iranian seaports. The financial physics of this event were incredibly blunt. When you physically stop shipping out oil, the inbound capital immediately ceases, and everything downstream violently halts with it. The state treasury was drained, and government salaries rapidly dried up. The vast network of civil servants and bureaucrats working for the government suddenly could not get paid. But the fatal regime-ending fracture occurred strictly within the security apparatus. The Shah relied heavily on a terrifying, well-funded enforcement arm to stay in power and suppress domestic dissent. However, loyalty in an autocracy is a rented commodity. As the paychecks bounced, that critical loyalty slowly started to disappear. These brutal enforcers did not suddenly experience a theological awakening or transform into devout revolutionaries overnight. The reality was exceptionally cold. They were simply not getting paid. A heavily armed enforcer will ruthlessly suppress a protest, but they fundamentally do not want to fight for a Shah who is completely failing to support their own families. The speed of this total systemic failure was staggering, happening far faster than many modern analysts realize. Observe the chilling timeline of the collapse. In December of 1978, the critical oil exports essentially stopped. By mid-January of 1979, literally 45 days away, the entire security apparatus paralyzed, forcing the Shah to flee the country and abandoning his throne. The exact same mathematical sequence is happening right now. The older men running the Islamic Republic, especially the top-tier leaders who engineered the 1979 revolt, know exactly how dangerous this specific vulnerability is. The ghost of 1979 is not merely a historical memory for these clerics. It is a terrifying, ticking countdown. The current regime is violently burning through its final strategic reserves while Western sanctions hammer their maritime oil exports. The IRGC, the modern equivalent of the Shah's enforcers, is already reporting massive payroll problems directly triggered by the blockade. The historical paradox is absolute. A totalitarian regime that cannot physically pay its own people to brutally enforce its will is a regime facing a terminal, existential problem. History is rhyming in ways that are deeply eerie for the men currently trapped inside Tehran's isolated halls of power. They are paralyzed by the realization that they are no longer the righteous revolutionaries. They have successfully transformed into the bankrupt, fragile monarch they overthrew. The 45-day clock has arguably already started. And as the internal panic aggressively sets in, the highest echelons of the regime are beginning to tear each other apart in plain view of the global intelligence community. The illusion of absolute iron-fisted unity is actively shattering at the highest echelons of the regime. We are currently witnessing an unprecedented, highly public fracture between the radical hardliners who control the fading arsenal and the political moderates attempting to salvage the collapsing state. The infighting has cascaded entirely out of control. The Iranian Speaker of Parliament, a figure desperately pushing for diplomatic off-ramps to save the economy, has reportedly been confined under strict house arrest. The IRGC simply will not allow any faction to negotiate their survival with the United States. The syndicate is openly cannibalizing its own government, publicly humiliating their own diplomats on the global stage without a shred of remorse or apology. They are a fractured leadership that cannot decide who leads, who concedes, or how to survive the month. And while they tear each other apart in Tehran, a massive kinetic anvil is being maneuvered into position. Intelligence indicates Washington has issued a blunt, unforgiving 3 to 5 day ultimatum for the regime to resolve its internal chaos. If the Islamic Republic fails to approach the negotiating table within that window, all hell will fundamentally break loose. That specific, terrifying timeline is not a diplomatic bluff. It is a mathematical alignment with the deployment of overwhelming naval supremacy. A third American aircraft carrier, the USS George H.W. Bush, is currently navigating east of the Horn of Africa. It will drop anchor in the Middle Eastern theater in exactly 3 to 5 days. The clock is relentlessly ticking, and the heavily armed syndicate has finally run out of runway. The architecture of 1979 is repeating, but this time, the regime is on the terrifying other side of the collapse. Do you think the Islamic Republic survives the next 12 months, or is a terminal internal fracture now inevitable? Give me your strategic assessment in the comments below.